Welcome to the next installment of the Patristica channel. I'm your host today, Mark G. Bilby. Today I'm going to be giving a two-part presentation, one part on the Patristica channel, the other part on my other channel, Voce Santice, and this is going to be a reprise of the presentation I gave in Chicago at the North American Patristics Society in late May. This particular presentation was part of a panel that included Jason BeDuhn, myself, Markus Vinzent, and Jack Bull. Jack has already given his presentation on the Patristica channel, basically re-performed it for our audience. So that's available. Please look for that. And so today I'm going to give a two-part, as I mentioned, presentation. The first part will focus on the history of scholarship on Marcion's Apostle, or Apostolicon, the collection of Paul's letters. And then the second part on what we can do with the data that we've curated now from that history of scholarship and from our team's recent work. So thanks for joining us. I hope you find this interesting. All right, the big question that I asked to members of the audience was, can data be heretical? And what would heretical data even look like? I think the implicit answer to that is no, data can't be heretical. Data is just data. It has nothing to do with orthodoxy or heresy. But if we were going to consider some data as heretical and treat it as heretical, how might we do that? And this is something of a window into the history of scholarship. So at this point, I think most of our audience are viewing it. So you might want to zoom in on your screens, but you can also just go through the history of scholarship for yourself and look at these past editions. Many of these are available on the Internet Archive because they've entered into the public domain. Some are not. But do your best to orient yourself in the history of scholarship. And I'm just going to provide snippets so that they are consistent with fair use, particularly for the editions that are still under copyright. So the first edition we can see here is that by August Hahn. First edition we'll be looking at, first major edition of Marcion's Gospel. This comes from 1832. It's part of a collection of Christian Apocrypha. And Marcion's Gospel looks quite similar to any of the other texts within that collection. The first major edition of Marcion's Apostle was by William Christian von Manen, and he only did a reconstruction of Marcion's Galatians, and it was within a journal, a Dutch journal at the time. Again, it looks pretty similar to any other Christian text, and including any New Testament texts that would have been produced at that time. When we come to Theodor Zahn's reconstruction, and Zahn was a brilliant genius of a scholar in the late 19th century, but we start to see some pretty fundamental changes to how the data is being represented and what's going on within the data. And this is both when it comes to Marcion's Gospel and when it comes to Marcion's Apostle. So I'll summarize some of the things I'm seeing in this that make it different from what we saw in Van Manen and Hahn. Then when we come to Harnack, it looks quite similar to what Zahn had been doing, but even more sort of new phenomenological things that we're seeing in the text, in the main running text. And again, like what we're looking at here with these snippets is the main running text with a little bit of the footnotes or the apparatus underneath. So you can see kind of both at the same time. So just look them over, see what do you see? What are you noticing? Then here are two of the more recent ones and often considered the authoritative editions. Ulrich Schmidt's reconstruction of Marcion's Apostle on the left. Again, just look at little things like typography, italics, underlining, bold, not bold, versus what's in, what's not. And then Dieter Roth's, again, for fair use reasons, I'm only giving a small snippet here from one page. But just help to look at the, what's going on here in the text. How is the main text being represented? What kinds of indications are being used? Right? What is your impression of this, thinking about this as data? But when I look at that history of scholarship and kind of the trajectory that I see with both texts in the history of scholarship, and I didn't look at Klinghart's or Nicolodes or BeDuhn's or the joint version of Marcion's Gospel that BeDuhn and I did together, or my own, right? Or our teams with Markus Vinzent leading it. our reconstruction of Marcion's apostle, but just looking at prior scholarship and what are often today seen as the authoritative versions, the takeaway I have is that these texts are not really meant to be performed, at least the recent editions of them. They're meant to be seen, not heard, kind of like the proverb, children are meant to be seen, not heard. So Marcion's texts, at least in their more recent editions by Zahn and Harnack, Schmid, and Roth, these texts are meant to be seen and not heard privately, that is not read aloud, and not meant to be heard liturgically. They're simply not meant to be performed. They're unperformable, right? And to me, that actually is the ultimate, sort of signal of how these texts are being read and interpreted and shared and published. Is, can they be performed or not? And if texts are unperformable, that is to make them heretical. This is not a plug for the Marcionite Church, which I won't go into detail here about. The hermeneutics of idiosyncratic subjectivity. So these recent editions that have been held up as authoritative, they often embed really complex systems of what we call indications in the scholarly world, like typography. How are you representing different phenomena or different types of phenomena? Often font, bold, italics, underlining, parentheses, all kinds of different symbols can be used to be indications of doubt in these. But here's kind of a list of the things that I saw, looking particularly at Zahn, Harnack, Schmid, and Roth. What we see are really the performance of strange things in the main running text. And again, this is part of what makes them unperformable as texts. We have variants embedded within the text itself. That's kind of clumsy if you want to read it aloud, especially. And it's just not typical practice. Usually variants are embedded within the apparatus, right, which is at the bottom of the page, not in the main running text. But Zahn, Harnack, and especially Roth will perform variants within the main text. Switching languages in the presentation of the text. Zahn does this, Harnack does this quite a lot, moving from Greek as the main language, sometimes to Latin, and then sometimes even to German, when he's not quite sure what the Greek would have been. Filling the text with labels such as unattested or not present. Those are fine as classification, notes, like the source of the text, or what your evaluation is about the source, its sources. But embedding those labels in the main text, that's kind of a strange thing to do. Placing descriptive and comparative commentary within the text, embedding these intricate custom indications of editorial doubt, and then even sometimes skipping over well-attested wording because the attestations are too numerous and or complex. That's really, really bizarre. In my assessment of the history of scholarship, not only of this text, but early Christian studies more generally, and classics more generally. It's like, to do that, to say something is just way too well attested and is so complex, we just can't even make a restoration decision in the main text. And as an example of that, I'm here particularly critiquing Roth. You don't see this in every, it's not all over the place, but in some particular places, Roth actually cites that there's too much evidence to make a reconstruction of a particular verse. So here, Evangelion 643, and Roth really stands out when we compare his work with other editors who restore, in this case, for this verse, 13, 14, 15 words, where Roth only restores 5 words. Basically saying, because it's so complex, because there are differences between these, we can't make a fulsome reconstruction. That, again, kind of bizarre, but it shows, again, maybe not an explicit bias, but an implicit bias to keep this data as heretical. The underlying sort of philosophical assumption that I see in Roth and Schmid's work, particularly, is what I would call patristic Cartesianism. This, again, whether this is operating on a conscious level or a subconscious level, I don't know. But what I see here at work is a premise, basically, that the church fathers are our main source and starting point for the reconstruction of Marcion scriptures in general. And on that premise, therefore, logically speaking, we can only have verifiable knowledge about a specific chapter, verse, phrase, or word in these texts if the church fathers attest to it, right? If you're familiar with the philosophy of Rene Descartes, his major, magnum opus of philosophy started with radical doubt. Rene Descartes doubting his senses, doubting the reliability of his senses, doubting the reliability of his memory, all reasonable, things to do. And he only comes to some kind of modest certainty through the realization that because he's a thinking thing, he exists, right? Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. It's almost as if these editors like Roth and Schmid have taken Descartes' method of radical doubt and applied it to Marcion's texts, and I would say Harnack and Zahn before them. Unless the church fathers specifically attest to words like in that spot, we can't know what those words are, right? Another way of classifying this way of thinking or this modus operandi is as what I would call naive patristic verifiability. Only if the church fathers tell us something was in the text, that's the only way we can know that that word was in the text. And that is a really bizarre way of thinking. And it's completely unscientific. What I would say a scientific approach would be to these texts, as with any other texts from any other time, if they're missing content, if there's variance, whatever it may be, is that a scientific approach would adopt probabilistic pattern verifiability, right? Science is mainly and primarily about observable phenomena, right? It's looking at data, whatever source it may come from, right? It may come, in the case of Marcion scriptures, from attestations by the church fathers in that location, but it could also come from attestations that they make in other locations, right? Or in other works. It may come from parallel verses in the canonical texts and in all the variants of those texts. But it can also come when we dig into the data at a deeper level and encode it and look at the patterns that we find, particularly in attested material, what the church fathers attest to, not just in one place, but in all places for Marcion scriptures, and what they attest to as not present. And if there are meaningful and even statistically significant differences between the profiles, the data sets from the attested as present and the attested as not present material, those two profiles are a massive, deep, multi-layered data source that we can use in order to reconstruct Marcion's gospel. But the main approach here is simply operating based on probabilistic pattern verifiability, right? It's making binary decisions. Was a chapter there or was it not, right? What do the probabilities say? Then take it to a more granular level of a verse or a clause or a word. Was this word in? Was this word not in? Was this two-word, phrase in there or not? Was this clause in there or not? Right. At every turn, we have a probabilistic decision to make. And these are reconstructive decisions, but that's kind of the name of the game, right? None of us have access, even with the canonical scriptures, to what these originally look like, if there was ever such a thing as an original, right? I tend to think that these texts were evolving over time, even the canonical texts. And so we're always looking at snapshots in time. We're not ever looking at like the one authoritative source. Just that's not how humans produce knowledge when we look carefully at human knowledge creation patterns throughout time. So data science is using probabilistic decisions. All right, to be useful and usable, data must be normalized, and that includes even heretical data. Again, I think this is my unique contribution to Marcionite studies, but also early Christian studies more generally when it comes to the Marcionite texts, is to take these data that were treated in this really bizarre way to make them heretical. Again, probably not consciously so, but maybe unconsciously so, and to just normalize them, to treat them as normal data, and to treat them the same way as we would treat any other data. So when we look at data normalization, what does that entail? Well, it means adopting all the standards that are used in data science, particularly in historical corpus linguistics, computational linguistics, in this day and age, right? We need to make this data useful, usable, interoperable, citable, all these kinds of things. So we need to encode it with Unicode. That's the main standard today. We need to use standardized file types like comma separated values, tab separated values, extensible markup language, XML. We need standardized field types, location, text, attestations, notes, apparatus, right? All those things. And to consistently enforce those field types, not sort of have cross-contamination or leakage between different field types, as we saw in previous editions. We need standardized schema types, TI-XML, Perseus, the patristic text archive, and then to validate against those schema so that these texts are interoperable with major systems and can be embedded in major corpora. We need identifier types, permanent IDs, like digital object identifiers, DOIs, CTS URNs. We need version control, whether in Git or in Zenodo or in other kinds of platforms, to make the process of curating the data and any corrections that we make to be transparent, right? That's part of making data trustworthy is to make those processes more transparent. Using standardized distribution architecture. So this is the Kapitän's system or Kapitän's system. And that allows us to check and validate the data and make sure it's structured well and clean so that it can be used and ingested in other systems. To use thoughtful file copyright and licensing, trying to like walk a line between making things publicly available without allowing it to be exploited by bad actors. Binary editorial rendering decisions with all of these things, and then a structured apparatus separate from the main text and attestations. All right, so, and that's essentially what we've done, but it's also, this is kind of a critique and a summons to scholars more generally, like, let's stop making bespoke, difficult to read, difficult to interpret, idiosyncratic editions of Marcion scriptures, and let's start working with and in and across standardized data using standardized, normalized approaches to this data. So, you know, embedding editorial feelings, that's not a problem at all. People can have different levels of confidence, but we don't need 10 levels of confidence. That's just ridiculous, right? That's not helping anybody. What we need is a standardized metadata approach to those editorial feelings. So the patristic text archive does not allow for 10 different kinds of feelings to be embedded about what an editor thinks about a specific word or verse. It allows 2, high and low, along with a tag type called proposition. So again, editors can have feelings, but they should be simplified and not overcomplicate the text itself. All right, that's the end of my first dig into this, and then I will, as I mentioned, go over to my other channel, Voce Antiche, and do a deeper dive into the kinds of data sets that we've been producing and how we're starting to use those in various ways. So we've already been using this data for 2+ years for our work on the Apostolos. So I'll show you some of the fruits of that labor and then some of the directions that research is going. Thanks for joining.